Hey guys, Matthew here. In today's video, we're going to be going over the upcoming 3.17 League Balance Manifesto. So as always, I'm not going to read you through the whole thing because there's just way too much, and you could do that on your own. I'm mostly going to focus on the important things and the implications of some of these changes. And I'm going to try to focus mostly on the things that are most likely to affect you as a player, and basically the builds that people actually care about, not the things that are super niche. The first thing that they wanted to change was hit-based spellcasting. So what that means is self-cast. GGG want people to play more builds that require the characters themselves to cast the spells and not some other form of casting, like either cast on channeling, cast on crit, totems, traps, mines, stuff like that. Overall, there is some pretty massive numerical changes. It seems like every skill on this list has been buffed by about 50% or so, and have had their damage effectiveness also upped by upwards of 50%, in some cases even doubled, or almost doubled, which is absolutely insane. That is crazy. And what that means is that if you were planning on playing any of these builds, you should be quite happy. However, if you're not planning on playing any of these builds that are listed here on something like a trap or like a mine or even a totem, you are probably overall going to be losing out on your build. About 20 to 30% damage has been the nerf of most of the support gems that are turning your self-cast skills into things like mines or totems and the likes. So yeah, roughly you're losing 20% damage on your build if you're not playing a build that has been made up for it, if you will, on the numerical changes. However, there is one exception to that rule, which is cast on crit. Cast on crit, they definitely went heavy-handed on the nerfs, and they've nerfed it by roughly 40%, which is definitely pretty substantial compared to, say, for example, high-impact mines only getting nerfed by roughly 22%. So yeah, they definitely went heavy-handed on the cast on crit, which makes sense because cast on crit has been pretty much the best archetype for a very long time, and they want it to be more in line with other things. Now, mines and traps and totems have also been very, very good, especially mines being definitely at the top of the charts, especially for doing damage on a very, very cheap budget. So all of these nerfs do make sense. But overall, if you're playing one of these builds, like say for example, if you were playing, you're planning to play Arc on a totem build, well, you are going to do more damage despite the totem nerf because the Arc buff is substantial, and this applies to every single one of these skills, as long as they don't have any sort of interaction with the Hydrosphere, as I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Alright, they've done some numerical changes to some other skills which were underplayed, things like Explosive Trap, Lightning Trap, Blade Trap, blah, blah, blah. Another change that they've done is to Unleash. Now, they felt that Unleash was a little bit too popular when it comes to self-casting, so they nerfed it not significantly, but by about 20%, which is honestly not that big of a deal, especially if you're playing one of these skills. At the end of the day, that means that you're still getting a pretty massive buff, because 20% reduced on the Unleash, and then these massive changes upwards means that you're still getting like way stronger than your build was before. Now, another thing that they did is they made cast speed way more available, if you will, and they also upped the damage on cast speed. So overall, you are going to be able to get a lot more cast speed on your build. This is especially good for brand builds. When they nerfed the brand clusters, brand builds lost a ton of cast speed, and these changes here are definitely going to bring brands probably not back to the top as they used to be, but definitely a little bit better than they were, especially on the high end, because you're going to be able to get somewhere around 25% more cast speed overall if you were to get it on your dagger or your wand, and then of course your rings and your amulet. So overall, it's a pretty substantial change. 25% cast speed on a brand build is a huge deal. So yeah. Now, another thing is Threshold Jewels. A lot of them were just completely removed or reworked to basically no longer give additional projectiles and the likes. But to make up for that, they basically added more projectiles on the base skill gems instead. Things like Ethereal Knives. It lost 5 projectiles from the Ring of Blades unique jewel, but they added an extra 3, so you're only really losing 2 projectiles. Spark, you're losing only 1 projectile. And the numerical buffs are so massive that you are definitely getting buffed if you were planning to play any of those builds. For example, Ethereal Knives used to do 950, or sorry, used to do 630 to 950, now it's do 950 to 1420, which is a buff of like 40-ish% or somewhere around there. And you are losing one projectile, but it has a damage effectiveness of 220% versus 120%, which is an extra 100% damage effectiveness. And what that means essentially is that every one flat damage that you're adding onto your build is now going to be worth, instead of 1.2, 2.2. And that is therefore going to, of course, be multiplied by all of your other increases and multipliers on your build. Essentially, this is the base damage where everything starts to scale. So 100% damage effectiveness is unheard of. These sort of buffs are crazy. So these are sort of buffs that will take a skill that nobody has played for a million years into some very, very popular skills. However, the skill itself will depend, and of course the meta will depend. But some of these changes are numerically speaking, are definitely pretty big. Okay, Orb of Storms have been changed pretty drastically in terms of how it works. But overall, it just means that your positioning is going to be more flexible. You won't have to be directly inside the bubble in order to get the zap effect whenever you're using a lightning spell. You'll be able to be outside of it, which is just going to be a little bit better. However, it got its strikes lowered quite a bit, by over half actually. So it's going to be a lot slower. But because you no longer have to be directly inside, it means that overall it's probably going to be roughly the same in terms of leveling especially, but it's going to be a lot better for single target as they have drastically improved the single target. All right, Ignite compensation changes. Now, they've nerfed all Ignites across the board by, I believe, 28% is what they said or something like that. But some skills have been compensated for that, and some skills have been compensated heavily. For example, Explosive Arrow now deals 5% more damage with hits and elements per Explosive Arrow on target, and this was previously just with hits. Now, this means that your Ignites, which do stack, are basically also going to be stacking this 5% more damage with hits and elements. Which is insane. That means overall probably somewhere around a 50% more damage on Explosive Arrow, which was also looking to be a pretty popular league starter. There's a lot of people currently testing this build out on some small budget for league start variations. Looking at my buddy Crouching Tuna and Palstron are two content creators that come to mind who are planning on making Explosive Arrow league starters. And this buff right here basically is going to take a skill which was looking to be pretty good into a skill which is probably going to be very, very, very good. This is especially going to help the single target, as the clear on that build is already very, very good. Otherwise, not much else to talk about. Fire Burst got nerfed pretty heavily by a 50% increase in its cooldown. Overall, that's just not good, and the damage is probably not going to make up for it. Penance Brand now deals 90% more damage with elements per energy instead of 60%, so that's a 50% increase for elements with Penance Brand. So if you're planning to play something like an Ignite Penance, it is going to be quite significantly better than it would have been before. All right, another problem that they had was with hit-based bow builds. So essentially, they think that bow builds are too weak, which makes sense because they kind of are. And their way of fixing that, if you will, or one of their ways of fixing that, was to provide new quivers, which I would have to say are a lot better. For example, Broadhead Quiver now has up to 10% attack speed, and it's implicit instead of like 6 to 12 physical damage, which was very negligible. And there is a new quiver replacing the Broadhead, which used to be the best physical quiver, which 16 to 27 heavy Harrow Quiver is definitely going to be pretty good for physical builds. And then of course there's also a new quiver with just Wed as an implicit for builds like Ignite, for example, which can scale with elemental damage with attack skills. So this is overall just really good. They've also changed some of the ascendancies, if I remember correctly. Yeah, on the masteries. But it doesn't seem to be too crazy on the changes for the masteries, but the new quivers do seem like they will be quite good. And another decent change is, instead of having increased elemental damage with attack skills on quivers, they will roll increased damage with bow skills. What that means is that Wed, which used to only apply to elemental builds, is now going to be able to apply to things like Toxic Rain. And this is a pretty significant buff which will make up for a nerf, which I'll be talking about a little bit later on. Source of added damage, basically the skill gems that were just outright just adding more flat damage to your builds have all been nerfed by roughly 10%. But remember what I said earlier, a lot of the skills have had their numerical values increase quite significantly. So it might be a good idea to just consider not using these gems at all instead, and using something else, since the base values have been increased so much. Or if it's still the best, you'll still be able to use these. And of course, you will still, be fine, but you'll lose about 10% from the support gem. However, the numerical buffs were so big in some of the cases mentioned up above that this is like negligible, honestly. And to make up for that, they've also added more flat damage to the modifiers. Now, what that means overall is that people who are investing a little bit more onto their weapons are overall going to be getting more value, because this 10% nerf is easily made up by these buffs to the weapon bases, or not bases, sorry, but the weapon modifiers. But of course, weapon modifiers don't come for free. Meanwhile, skill gems technically kind of come for free, right? You equip the skill gem, you get the increase in damage. You don't have to invest anything further. Now you'll actually have to get better weapons to make up for that damage loss if you're not playing one of the skills that have been buffed in this patch. Now, we don't know the extent of every single one of the skills that have been buffed. This is just the manifesto, not the patch notes. Same thing has been done to spell for like flat spell damage to weapons. It's also been buffed across the board, which is really good, especially paired with the damage effectiveness buffs, which in some cases are absolutely ridiculous. Looking at things like Ethereal Knives, for example, getting 100% additional damage effectiveness. Pair that up with more flat damage available on weapons, and you've got yourself some pretty heavy hitters. Okay, next thing is Hydrosphere. Basically, if your build was abusing Hydrosphere or worked because of Hydrosphere and the interaction with it, being able to just chain off of it constantly, your build is probably dead. So things like Eye of Winter Miner, things like Fireball Miner, things that needed Hydrosphere in order to really dish out some serious damage are pretty much left in the gutter. However, there is Tornado to replace Hydrosphere, but I personally have tried Tornado when it came out, and I thought it was, for some reason, while it should technically do the same exact thing as Hydrosphere, Tornado was nowhere near as good as Hydrosphere when it came to basically shotgunning bosses. So yeah, that's a bit of a shame. One of my league starters that I was probably planning on making a build guide for, once again, Eye of Winter Mines, is probably no longer going to be very, very good. Triggering marks. Now, this is a bit of a weird one, but essentially marks are now no longer going to be have a timer, so they are going to be permanent. But to make up for that, they have removed the influence modifiers. So Assassin's Mark on Hit rings, for example, have been completely removed from the modifier pool. However, there will be a new support called Mark on Hit, which is basically like Hex Touch support in order to apply Curse, but this one is going to apply a Mark. Now, the downside is this is only working for attacks. So if you're a spell build looking to get a mark on your build, you will basically just have to to self-cast it, or to put it through something like a brand or something like that, like Arcanist brand. But yeah, that's pretty much it when it comes to marks. It's not too big of a deal, I feel, because marks only ever applied when hitting rare or unique enemies anyways. So it's not like you ever really needed a mark in order to clear a map. It was only really used for single target. Okay, fortification and damage reductions. So yeah, basically, if you were either in Simulacrums, in Deep Delve, or in Delirium maps, monsters' HP doesn't scale that much. What does scale is monster damage reduction. And now monster damage reduction makes it so your hits are very, very small. So you're not really getting the fortification that you should have been getting. So they changed it to ignore target's damage reduction. So that means that if you're struggling to get your maximum fortification stacks and things like Simulacrums, you're probably going to have a much easier time now. And this is the same for Deep Delve. Okay, now, problem. Detonate's dead. Detonate dead. Now, when I first read that, I thought that it had finally killed Detonate dead. But it turns out that they basically barely touched it. The only change is that Desecrate and Corpse Walk now have a static 15% chance to spawn a Spectre Corpse rather than a 2 times relative weighting compared to all other possible corpse types. Essentially, because this is per corpse and not per cast, it just means that your damage is going to be more consistent. You're going to have less spikes of damage whenever you get the relative weighting to actually proc and to get your Spectre Corpses. And it's just going to be way more consistent. So your mapping experience is going to be more consistent, probably a little bit slower at the end of the day, but your bossing damage might actually be better because it's going to be more consistent. So yeah, it's not really a nerf. It's more just a little bit of a swap of how the build works. But overall, Detonate Dead is still completely fine. And this is surprising to me, but not as much as the following one. Seismic Trap. Now, Seismic Trap has a very high damage scaling when it scales damage with increased area of effect, and this is because of the overlapping, right? Now, what they did essentially is that they're going to make the modifiers of area of effect applied to Seismic Trap's burst can target at a ratio, which means they're no longer going to completely overlap. They will still overlap. It's just going to be a little bit more spread out. There's going to be a ratio to it instead of being completely random, which it seems to be right now. You could literally have 4 explosions on top of each other. But that's it, right? That is the only thing that they're doing to Seismic Trap. Now, of course, we don't know if that's actually the extent of it, but if that's it, if you're planning to play Seismic Trap again because you really enjoyed it last league, this is not a big deal whatsoever because the builds typically do not scale area of effect when it comes to playing Seismic Trap. It's really not a huge priority. Now, it's good, but it does mean overall that by changing this area of effect scaling, you'll no longer really rely on things like Carcass Jack. You'll probably go with just any other chess piece, maybe something more defensive, maybe something like a Skin of Lords, Skin of Loyals for more damage. But yeah, you just won't really rely on the area of effect scaling, or you can just, instead of focusing on the area of effect, focus on the actual frequency of how fast the trap explodes, which is all based on trap throwing speed. So that means that you could go with things like, for example, start scaling more on the stacking of frenzy charges. Could be a very good way to scale Seismic Trap. Now, of course, I will be making a league start for Seismic Trap, a revised league starter, which is a lot more tanky than my last one for Seismic Trap if it actually does end up surviving the patch notes, because I have a feeling that Detonate Dead and Seismic Trap might see a little bit more love. If not, that is going to be very surprising, as these were some of the most popular builds in pretty much all of the events, the Gauntlet included, and of course in the league. So not seeing any real radical nerf is very strange. I was expecting some triple-sided nerf to where they would basically completely kill it off, but so far so good. Now, Toxic Rain has been nerfed a little bit. It's been nerfed by roughly 20%. Now, you'd think that this is a really bad thing, but remember what I said earlier, Quivers are getting buffed. Elemental damage with attack skills is now going to apply to things like poison or things like damage over time, like with basically anything that attacks with a bow. So overall, this is probably not going to be too big of a nerf, especially with the new Quiver, right? There's a new Quiver that also gives you 10% attack speed. This is a massive buff to Toxic Rain. 10% attack speed on Toxic Rain is huge, right? So that is something that is easily going to make up for this little nerf over here. I think they just did that to make it so Toxic Rain didn't just get buffed even more, because Toxic Rain is already in a very, very good spot. Okay, now, one thing that definitely did die completely is March of the Legion. Now, March of the Legion has been used for very specific builds, such as the Armor Stacking Aura Stacker. Needless to say, that is probably not going to survive the March of the Legion decimation, because that's exactly what's happening here. March of the Legion is getting completely annihilated. It's only going to work with a single gem now. You're no longer going to get 4 auras for free. It's only going to be 1, and it's going to cost mana instead of reserving mana. But the aura will be buffed a little bit more than, you know, it usually would, but I still don't think this is going to be an item that people are too fond of, especially because, you know, you have to give up things like Tailwind Boots in order to use it. But yeah, March of the Legion, definitely a huge F. Now, here's another one that definitely got absolutely destroyed, and that is the Shade Form. Now, this was used by a very specific build, which was, what's it called? Shatter, something Shatter, I can't remember right now. I totally deleted it from my list too. But Juggernaut, which was basically inflicting trauma stacks on themselves, but because of the Shade Form, they were able to get completely immune to physical damage. So they could just stack trauma stacks forever until they had, well, basically infinite damage, and they were pretty much completely immune. especially to physical damage. And then, of course, because there's other ways of getting nearly immune to elemental damage, the build was almost immortal, and it did ridiculous amounts of damage. GGG definitely didn't think that that was going to be a good thing for the game, so they kind of got rid of it entirely. Basically, it's going to have a duration that is sorry, the cooldown is paused when the skill is active, which means you would only ever get at most 50% uptime on your Shade Form skill, which means if you're trying to do that build again with the trauma stacks, you would just kind of hit yourself and then die. So obviously that build is pretty dead. Another build that was basically immortal using Strength of Blood, which you could scale the modifiers to life recovery rate, allowing to reach 100% and characters to be completely immune to damage, like literally immortal. Strength of Blood's damage reduction no longer scale with modifiers to life recovery rate, so essentially that build, or that archetype of immortal build, is also completely dead, which again is a good thing for the game. Immortal builds are never good. Dancing Dervish has been changed. Basically, it's just a quality of life change. You don't need to spawn them anymore. You kind of just need to hit once a melee attack, and then the Dervishes are going to spawn. And then the cool thing is that they have decided to change this to make it so they gain Rampage on melee hit. So instead of you getting Rampage, it is actually the Dancing Dervish. You hit something, the Dancing Dervish spawns, it hits something, it gets Rampage stacks, and then you can scale the Rampage the same way that you used to. So at the end of the day, it's just a basic buff to quality of life that you don't have to worry about, trying to proc Rampage yourself. And of course, you don't have to worry about your Dancing Dervishes ever expiring, because now they'll basically be permanent once spawned, pretty much, is the big deal. If you ever lose them, you kind of just walk up to a monster, hit it once with a melee attack of some sort, and then they'll respawn and be good to go. And this, of course, you can use Writhing Jar, which is the warm jar, to spawn them again. So as long as you have any sort of flash charges on your build, to where if you ever run out of them on like a boss with phases or something, you can just pop your flask, kill a worm, and the Dancing Dervishes are going to come right back with Rampage stacking on hit. Pretty nice quality of life, but nothing crazy. Okay, Perfidy's Dread Banner Fortification duration. Now, I don't think anybody ever uses Perfidy's. I've never even heard of this. Now, I know what it is. It's the Simulacrum unique, but yeah, I don't even know what that means. So whatever. And then the next thing is that Voidfletcher outclasses Rare Quivers for many builds. So they are going to review Voidfletcher. Now, we don't know what that means. Are they completely going to kill it with some triple-sided nerf like they usually do? Or are they going to get the Seismic treatment where they're basically just giving a little tiny slap on the wrist and it's going to be just fine? We don't really know. We'll have to wait for patch notes. It seems like they haven't really decided on the values just yet. But that is pretty much it for the Balance Manifesto and everything that is like more important, if you will. So hopefully you guys enjoyed my summary. As always, before I go, I want to say a huge thank you to my supporters. So like him, Hamad, Max, Georgie, Rascoro, Stan, Brandon, welcome back, Thomas, Nate, the Great Master, Alex, the other Alex, Tim, Mercury, Johnny, Scott, Nail It, Kevin, Killer Kev, Dubstep, Alex, Bitizen, Inks, and Jarek. Again, hopefully you guys enjoyed. Next video will probably be one in regards to early league Simulacrum farming builds, which is something that I've currently been testing. So hopefully you guys are looking forward to that. After that, it'll probably be once the announcement comes out in a few days. So, I'll catch you guys then. Peace out.